Well, I'm lucky to be joined now by a man who may well be one of the best able to explain what happened. Mark Harper is the chair of the COVID recovery group of MPs and joins me now. Welcome to the programme, Mark. This was always going to pass. The Labour Party supporting this piece of legislation, the Conservative Party supporting this piece of legislation. But just for people who don't follow the ins and outs of parliamentary procedure, why didn't it go to a formal vote?
So what happens is if there aren't enough people to oppose a piece of legislation and it's clear to the chair, so in this case to the Deputy Speaker, Rosie Winterton, that it's going to pass, then there won't always be a formal vote. I was clear in the debate, if there'd been a vote, I wouldn't have supported the legislation because I don't think it gives ministers powers, but it doesn't have enough parliamentary scrutiny, enough requirement for ministers to come back to Parliament to make their arguments and to get parliamentary approval at each stage. And that's also, by the way, the problem with the Public Health Act, which you mentioned in your preamble.
No, it does seem that these are pretty sweeping powers, and it's understandable at the start of the pandemic that these were sort of passed very quickly. I think it only spent one day in the House of Commons while everyone was panicked. No one knew how much the House of Commons could actually work during the pandemic. The ministers were given a lot of power. That really doesn't seem like it's so necessary now, particularly as we know just how well our technology can sometimes work in terms of communicating and in terms of scrutinising.
No, I'm very clear about it. If ministers want to take steps now, significant steps, they need to come to Parliament in advance and get Parliament's approval. And we had that debate yesterday about vaccine passports. And I made it very clear that if the government were ever to propose vaccine, which I don't support, pointless, damaging and discriminatory, it should come to Parliament in advance and seek Parliament's approval through a vote before even contemplating such a thing. And actually, I'm pleased that the Secretary of State, Sajid Javid, made it clear that that's the approach that he would want to follow. And I think that's the right approach going forward. Is perfectly reasonable for ministers to propose things, but there needs to be proper scrutiny in Parliament. And that's something, of course, that my group's been doing. We haven't had a lot of support from the Labour Party, who've been absent through most of this process, haven't been challenged, haven't been asking questions that need to be asked. That's the job of MPs after.
Yes, I think when it comes to so many COVID issues, it's actually your group and yourself who could be more accurately described as a leader of the opposition than Sir Keir Starmer. But let's get to the substance of the legislation, because the government did say it had removed vital parts of the Coronavirus Powers Act. There are some of the more draconian bits of this legislation that are no longer on the statute books. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. To be fair, probably, I suspect, because of a lot of the pressure that we've put on the government. The worst bits of the Act have been removed. So there are no longer powers to detain people indefinitely if they have COVID. A lot of the rules about banning gatherings and shutting down parts of the economy have been removed. And a lot of what's left are about things like allowing sick pay from day one, allowing courts to use electronic links to have trials, and things like that, most of which are not actually that objectionable. So most of the damaging pieces have been removed. But it's worth remembering that all of the lockdowns, all of the massive disruption to society wasn't delivered using the Coronavirus Act. It was all done through the Public Health Act. And that Act remains in place, and all those powers remain available to ministers if they so desire.
And that Act has been on the statute books for many, many decades. Appropriately, as I mentioned earlier, passed in 1984, which has a little Orwellian ring to it. This seems to be the focus of what's going on now. Why were people so focused on the Coronavirus Powers Act when actually it seems that the Public Health Act seems to be the bigger culprit here when we're talking about shutting down vast swathes of our economy and restricting people's individual autonomy?
Well, it's partly because the Coronavirus Act has to be renewed every 6 months. It does provide an opportunity for MPs to debate it and vote on it. The Public Health Act is already in force. And when ministers bring forward proposals under the Public Health Act, they can do them in advance. They can simply pass them by the stroke of a pen, ministerial diktat, if you like. And MPs only get to vote on things retrospectively. Government so desires. And it doesn't give MPs a lot of chance to scrutinise them. So one of the things that we've been campaigning for, my colleague Steve Baker has been leading on, is to reform the public. So it still gives ministers necessary powers to act in an emergency, but it requires them to come to Parliament, justify what they're doing, and has a lot closer parliamentary control. And I think that's appropriate in a democracy.
That sounds like a really interesting point there. So it could be the case that after this pandemic, if you and Steve Baker and others in the COVID recovery group are successful in reforming the Public Health Act, it could be the case that the draconian powers that the government has accrued during this time and indeed before would be less than before the pandemic. This would be sort of a once-in-a-lifetime event, that we have a crisis and the government may well have fewer powers at the end of it. What are your chances of success here?
Well, honest answer is I don't know, but I think a lot of people have been very uncomfortable with the ability of government to take action without parliamentary control. So I think, look, most people would agree, in an emergency, government needs to be able to act. And I have no problem with ministers having quite strong executive powers, but they have to be properly controlled. So if you take another piece of legislation, the Civil Contingencies Act, measure that's used when there's a national emergency, ministers have a lot of power. They can do almost anything they want, but they have to come back to Parliament very quickly, within days, to get Parliament's approval. They can't just wait for 6 months and come back to Parliament every 6 months. So I think there's a deal here, which is ministers should have the powers to act in an emergency. That's quite proper and right. But they should have to come back to Parliament quickly to secure Parliament's approval on a regular basis to check that those powers are exercised properly. I think that's how the public can rest assured that ministers are making a good case, they're not overstepping things, and they're acting in the interest of the public.
I have to say that sounds incredibly level-headed. It's parliamentary scrutiny, sunset clauses, and indeed those votes in Parliament that are so crucial to make sure that we don't have overbearing government. Mark Harper, thank you so much for your time this afternoon on the briefing on GB News. Really appreciate it.